The Interstellar Combat Institute on Station Kepler 9 had seen its fair share of legendary instructors over the centuries. There was Commander Vorthak, who could disintegrate a plasma rifle with his bare tentacles. General Sylith, whose psychic warfare techniques had ended 3 separate galactic conflicts before lunch. And then, well, then there was Hana. Just Hana. No impressive titles, no exotic abilities that defied the laws of physics, no evolutionary advantages that made other species weep with envy. She was, by all accounts, embarrassingly ordinary. Human, which, according to the prevailing wisdom of the Galactic Council, was roughly equivalent to being a slightly clever rock with delusions of grandeur. Ghost, they called her, though not for any mystical reasons the cadets might hope for. The nickname had stuck after her first week at the academy, when she'd managed to slip past 16 different security checkpoints, 3 AI surveillance systems, and 1 very paranoid Krillian guard captain, just to prove a point about perimeter defense. The point being, apparently, that it was absolute garbage. This particular morning found Ghost, Hana, standing before her latest batch of cadets in Training Bay 12, hands clasped behind her back, wearing that expression that had become her trademark. It wasn't quite a smile, wasn't quite a smirk. It was something far more dangerous, the look of someone who knew a joke that nobody else had figured out yet. "Right then," she said, her voice carrying that peculiar blend of authority and amusement that had made hardened veterans question their life choices. "Let's meet today's cannon fodder, shall we?" The 4 cadets arranged themselves in what they clearly believed was an intimidating display of galactic unity. They were wrong, of course, but Hana had long since learned that correcting assumptions too early spoiled all the fun. Blix stood at attention with the rigid precision that only came from a hive-mind upbringing. The Kithane's chitinous exoskeleton gleamed under the training bay's harsh lights, compound eyes processing information at a rate that would make a quantum computer weep with inadequacy. When Blix spoke, it was with the collective wisdom of billions. "Instructor Ghost," they said, voice carrying harmonics that suggested an entire civilization backing each syllable. "We have studied your species' military history. The statistical probability of human tactical success against modern galactic warfare protocols is amusing." "Amusing," Hana repeated, that almost smile growing a fraction wider. "Well, aren't you a charmer?" Next to Blix, Jorek rumbled what might have been agreement, if agreement could be expressed through sounds that suggested tectonic plates having a disagreement. The Drakmori's scales rippled with patterns that spoke of barely contained violence, his warrior culture's influence written in every controlled movement. To Jorek, honor was everything. Strength was sacred, and humans, well, humans were neither. "My ancestors conquered 16 star systems with blade and claw," he growled, the words carrying undertones of sulfur and distant thunder. "Your species required tools just to survive their own homeworld. It is quaint." "Quaint?" Hana laughed, a sound that somehow managed to be both delighted and slightly unhinged. "Oh, I do like this batch." Fenna, crystalline and radiant, shifted with the musical chiming that accompanied all Zelani movement. Her empathic abilities were legendary, capable of reading emotional states across vast distances, sensing intentions before they were fully formed. She was, in essence, a living lie detector with a moral compass that pointed unerringly toward peace. "Instructor," she said, her voice like wind chimes caught in a gentle breeze, "I sense anticipation from you. Not nervousness, not concern. You are looking forward to something." "Perceptive," Hana acknowledged. "Gold star for the Crystal Lady." Finally, there was Grix, whose gaseous form swirled in patterns that suggested either deep thought or mild indigestion. The Netherian collective consciousness fragment had volunteered for individual duty, a concept so foreign to their species that it had required 3 separate galactic council meetings just to approve the paperwork. The singular is still strange, Grix admitted, their form flickering between states. But analysis suggests human combat doctrine relies heavily on unpredictability rather than proven tactical frameworks. It seems inefficient. Inefficient, Hana mused, beginning to pace in front of her students like a predator sizing up prey. Which, all things considered, wasn't far from the truth. You know what else is inefficient? Democracy. Article falling in love. Most of the best things in life are inefficient. That's what makes them interesting. The cadets exchanged glances, or whatever passed for glances among their respective species. They'd been warned about Ghost's tendency toward philosophical tangents, her habit of turning simple combat drills into exercises in existential questioning. What they hadn't been warned about was the way her eyes seemed to gleam when she talked about inefficiency, as if she'd just shared a secret joke with the universe. Today, Hana continued, we're going to experience the crown jewel of academy training, the Predator Protocol. The name landed in the training bay like a small explosive device. Every cadet straightened, even Grix's gaseous form solidifying slightly with what might have been surprise. The Predator Protocol was legend among academy students, whispered about in dormitories and discussed in hushed tones during meal periods. Blix's compound eyes whirred as they accessed their vast database. The Predator Protocol has a pass rate of approximately 18% among advanced cadets. It is considered the most challenging simulation in the Academy's repertoire. 18%, Hana repeated thoughtfully. Fascinating statistic. Tell me, Blix, what do you think that says about the simulation? That it is extremely difficult, and most cadets are inadequately prepared. Or ... Hana's smile finally revealed itself in all its terrifying glory. It says that most cadets are thinking about the problem entirely wrong. Jorik's scales shifted to a deeper shade of crimson, a sure sign of rising interest. You speak as though you know something we do not, human. Oh, my scaly friend, I know lots of things you don't. For instance, I know that your warrior culture's definition of honorable combat would get you killed in about 30 seconds flat if you ever encountered actual human military tactics. I know that Fenna's empathic abilities, impressive as they are, become a liability when facing something that doesn't experience emotion the way she understands it. I know that Blix's hive mind processing power means precisely nothing when the problem isn't computational, but psychological. And I know that Grix's collective consciousness gives them the wisdom of millions, none of whom ever had to think like an individual predator. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that suggested everyone was suddenly realizing they might be in over their heads. It was Hana's favorite kind of silence. Fenna's crystalline form chimed softly with distress. You seem pleased by our potential failures. Not pleased, Hana corrected, beginning to walk toward the simulation chamber's entrance. Educated. See, here's what nobody told you about the Predator Protocol. It wasn't designed by committee, like most Academy simulations. It wasn't built using standard galactic military doctrine or approved tactical frameworks. She paused at the chamber door, one hand on the activation panel, looking back at her students with something that might have been fondness if it weren't quite so predatory. The Predator Protocol was designed by humans, specifically by human military psychologists who spent considerable time studying exactly how apex predators hunt pack animals. The simulation isn't testing your combat skills, your technological advantages, or your species' evolutionary gifts. The chamber door hissed open, revealing the dark interior beyond. It's testing whether you can think like something that evolved to hunt in a universe that was actively trying to kill it every single day for millions of years. Something that learned to survive not by being the strongest, or the fastest, or the most technologically advanced, but by being nastier, more persistent, and significantly more creative about violence than anything else on its food chain. Blix's database access suddenly seemed very inadequate indeed. "And you believe this gives you an advantage?" Hannah's laugh echoed in the chamber, bouncing off walls that were already beginning to shift and change as the simulation initialized. "Oh, my dear little hive mind, I don't believe. It gives me an advantage." She stepped into the darkness, her voice carrying back to the increasingly nervous cadets. "I know it does, because, you see, there's something your databases don't tell you about humans, something the Galactic Council prefers to keep quiet." The chamber sealed behind them, and suddenly they were standing in what appeared to be a dense alien jungle, complete with sounds that suggested things with too many teeth and not enough moral fiber were watching from the shadows. "We didn't climb to the top of our food chain once," Hannah said, her voice now carrying in the humid air of the simulation. "We did it twice, first on Earth, then in space, and each time, everything else had to learn a very simple lesson." Something moved in the jungle, something big, something that suggested the simulation had just begun, and everyone who wasn't human was about to find out exactly why their species had nightmares about apex predators. "When you're dealing with humans," Hannah said, her voice now coming from somewhere else entirely, as if she'd already begun to melt into the jungle itself, "the only winning move is not to play. Unfortunately for you." The predator materialized from the shadows, a biomechanical nightmare that seemed to be built from every species' worst fears made manifest. It stood nearly 3 meters tall, moved with liquid grace, and radiated the kind of focused malevolence that suggested it was very good at its job. Class is now in session. And somewhere in the jungle, as 4 highly trained alien cadets instinctively moved closer together for protection and safety, a human instructor smiled in the darkness and prepared to teach them exactly why their ancestors had developed such colorful folklore about things that hunted in the night. The jungle that materialized around them was, to put it mildly, deeply unpleasant. Not in the obvious ways that simulations usually were. No lava pits, no acid rain, no conveniently placed spike traps that screamed, "This is a test," to anyone with functioning brain cells. No, this jungle was unpleasant in the way that real places were unpleasant. Subtly, persistently, and with a casual disregard for comfort that suggested it had been designed by someone who understood that true danger rarely announced itself with dramatic flourishes. The humidity hit them first, thick enough to swim through and carrying scents that spoke of decomposition, growth, and the eternal cycle of things eating other things. Overhead, a canopy so dense it might as well have been a ceiling, filtered the light into a dim green twilight, while somewhere in the distance, something that sounded like a cross between a dying whale and a rusty gate announced its presence to the world. "Atmospheric pressure optimal," Blix reported, their compound eyes already cataloging threats with mechanical precision. "Visibility reduced to approximately 30 meters. Environmental hazards include unstable terrain, potential toxins in the air supply, and—" They paused, processing, "numerous life signs of indeterminate origin." Wonderful, Jorik growled, his warrior instincts immediately pushing him into a defensive crouch. A proper hunting ground. Where is the human? That was, indeed, an excellent question. Somewhere between the chamber ceiling and the jungle materializing, Hana had managed to vanish entirely. One moment she'd been there, voice carrying that amused confidence that suggested she knew something they didn't. The next moment, nothing. She cannot have gone far, Fenna chimed, her crystalline form catching what little light filtered through the canopy and refracting it into nervous patterns. I can sense her emotional resonance, but it's strange, muted, as if she's deliberately dampening her presence. Grix swirled in agitation, their gaseous form condensing slightly. This is not standard protocol. Instructors are supposed to maintain oversight, provide guidance during simulations. Where is our tactical support? Maybe, Blix suggested, with the kind of logical certainty that only came from having access to the collective wisdom of billions, she is testing our ability to function independently. Standard procedure would be to establish a defensive perimeter, assess threats, and coordinate our natural advantages. Finally, Jorik rumbled approvingly, sense from the hive mind. And so they did exactly what their training, their instincts, and several million years of evolutionary programming told them to do. They moved closer together. It was, from a tactical standpoint, entirely reasonable. Blix's analytical capabilities could process environmental data, while the others focused on immediate threats. Jorik's combat prowess was most effective when he could be sure his allies were protected behind him. Fenna's empathic range was enhanced when she could maintain contact with her teammates, and Grix, despite their individual assignment, still functioned best as part of a collective unit. Within minutes, they had established a textbook defensive formation, backs to the center, weapons ready, scanning the jungle with the professional competence of beings trained by the finest military institution in known space. It was also, though they didn't realize it yet, exactly what something in the jungle was waiting for. The predator didn't announce itself with roars or dramatic entrances. It didn't crash through the underbrush or descend from the canopy with theatrical flair. It simply appeared. One moment, the jungle was empty of immediate threats. The next moment, there was something standing between the trees that definitely hadn't been there before. The first thing you noticed about the predator was that it was clearly the product of someone with both exceptional imagination and deeply concerning psychological issues. It stood roughly 3 meters tall, its biomechanical frame seeming to shift and flow between states, sometimes more machine, sometimes more creature, always maintaining that perfect balance of form and function that suggested evolution guided by malevolent intelligence. Its head, if head was the right word for the sensory cluster that crowned its shoulders, housed an array of detection equipment that would make a surveillance satellite jealous. Multiple eyes, thermal sensors, motion detectors, and several other organs whose purpose was probably best left unexamined. When it moved, it did so with the fluid grace of something that had been designed specifically for the task of turning other things into past tense versions of themselves. Contact, Blix announced unnecessarily, as the creature was now clearly visible to everyone present. Classification unknown. Threat assessment significant. The predator cocked its head, studying them with the focused attention of a connoisseur examining a particularly interesting vintage. Its gaze lingered on their formation, their defensive positioning, their careful coordination. And then, to their collective surprise, it began to circle them. Not hunting them, not attacking them, circling them like a shark who had found something curious enough to merit investigation, but not quite appetizing enough to warrant immediate consumption. "It's analyzing us," Fenna whispered, her empathic senses picking up something that made her crystalline structure chime with unease. "I can sense its attention, but not its emotions. It's like trying to read the feelings of a calculating machine." "Where is the human?" Jorik demanded, his scales shifting to combat colors. "She should be coordinating our response." That was when they heard it. Laughter. Not the kind of laughter that suggested amusement at something funny, but the kind that suggested someone was enjoying a private joke at everyone else's expense. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the jungle with a quality that made it impossible to pinpoint its source. "Oh, this is just perfect." Hana's voice drifted through the humid air, though she remained frustratingly invisible. "Look at you all, standing there like a gift-wrapped present. Formation Alpha 6, if I'm not mistaken. Very nice, very professional, very predictable." "Show yourself!" Jorik roared, his patience finally reaching its limit. What kind of instructor abandons her students in a combat simulation? "The kind," came the reply, now from a completely different direction. "Who wants to see if they've learned anything worth teaching? Tell me, my scaly friend, what's the first rule of dealing with an unknown predator?" Blix's database access kicked into overdrive. "Establish superiority through coordinated tactical response while maintaining defensive integrity and limiting exposure to—" "Wrong!" Hana's voice cut through the recitation with cheerful brutality. "The first rule is, don't let it choose the terms of engagement. The second rule is, if it's studying you, that means you're already doing something it expects you to do." The predator had completed its circuit, and was now standing directly in front of their formation, head tilted at an angle that suggested either curiosity or the kind of professional interest a chef might show in a particularly well-marbled cut of meat. "It's not attacking," Grix observed, their gaseous forms swirling with confusion. Standard predator behavior would suggest immediate aggression once optimal positioning is achieved. "Maybe," Fenna suggested hopefully, "it's not actually hostile? Perhaps this is a test of diplomatic contact rather than combat readiness?" The laughter that answered her suggestion was considerably less kind than before. "Oh, my dear crystal child," Hana's voice seemed to come from the predator itself now, though that was clearly impossible. "It's absolutely hostile. It's just not stupid. See, the thing about really effective predators is that they don't waste energy on unnecessary violence. Why fight 4 coordinated opponents when you can wait for them to make a mistake?" As if responding to some unseen signal, the predator began moving again, but instead of attacking their formation, it did something far more unsettling. It ignored them entirely. The creature turned away from the huddled cadets and began stalking through the jungle, its movements now displaying clear intent. It was hunting something. Something that, apparently, was far more interesting than 4 highly trained military cadets standing in perfect defensive formation. "What is it doing?" Jorik demanded, his warrior instincts completely baffled by prey that walked away from a fight. "It's hunting the real threat," Hana's voice answered, now clearly moving through the jungle, keeping pace with the predator. "The one that's not standing around in a neat little cluster, broadcasting its location and intentions to everything within a 5-kilometer radius." And that's when they realized the truth that would have been obvious to anyone who'd grown up on a world where everything was trying to kill you. The predator wasn't hunting them. It was hunting Hana, the human who had vanished into the jungle, who was moving through hostile territory alone, who was deliberately isolating herself from the safety and support of the group. The human who was, by every measure of tactical doctrine they'd ever learned, making the worst possible decisions. "She's going to get herself killed," Fenna whispered, her empathic senses now picking up the emotional resonance of the hunt, predator and prey locked in deadly dance through the jungle. "No," Blix said slowly, their analytical processes beginning to flag something their database hadn't accounted for. "I don't think she is." Because somewhere in the jungle, barely visible through the undergrowth, they could see flashes of movement that suggested the hunt was not going entirely as the predator had planned. Trees swayed without wind, shadows moved independently of their sources, and, occasionally, very faintly, they could hear sounds that suggested someone was having altogether too much fun with what should have been a life-or-death situation. "Bloody hell," Jorik muttered, his scales shifting to colors that indicated grudging respect. "The human's not running from it." "No," Grix agreed, their gaseous form starting to spread out as they tried to track the movements through their expanded awareness. "She's not running at all." Through the jungle, barely audible over the ambient sounds of a hostile environment, came the sound of Hannah's voice. Not calling for help, not coordinating with her students, not following any protocol they'd ever learned. She was humming, as she led the galaxy's most sophisticated hunting simulation on a merry chase through terrain that should have gotten her killed 10 times over. Humming as she demonstrated exactly why every other species in known space had developed such uncomfortable feelings about humans and their approach to survival. "Class is in session," her voice carried back to them one more time, full of dark amusement and promise. "Pay attention. You might learn something." And somewhere in the jungle, the predator discovered that it had made a fundamental error in target selection. It had chosen to hunt something that hunted back. The first sign that something had gone terribly wrong with the predator's hunting strategy came when the jungle fell silent. Not the kind of silence that meant danger was approaching. The 4 cadets had grown quite familiar with that particular variety over the past 20 minutes. This was different. This was the silence that meant something Apex had just established dominance so thoroughly that every other living thing in the vicinity had decided that breathing quietly was their new life priority. "Movement has ceased," Blix reported, their compound eyes scanning the undergrowth where the hunt had disappeared. No thermal signatures, no sound patterns consistent with ongoing pursuit. Jorik's scales rippled with frustrated confusion. Either the human is dead, or what? Fenna chimed nervously. "Or something else is," Grix finished, their gaseous form contracting with what might have been unease. That's when they heard the scream. It was a sound that bypassed rational thought and went straight to the primitive parts of the brain that remembered when darkness held teeth, and survival meant never being the slowest member of the herd. High-pitched, electronic, and utterly inhuman, it echoed through the jungle with the kind of raw terror that suggested something had just realized it was no longer the apex predator in this particular food chain. That, Jorik said slowly, was not the human. The silence that followed was pregnant with implications that none of them particularly wanted to examine. They were saved from having to process these implications by the sound of footsteps approaching through the undergrowth. Casual footsteps. The kind that suggested their owner was out for a pleasant stroll rather than emerging from mortal combat with a biomechanical nightmare. Hannah stepped into their defensive perimeter like she was walking into her own living room, completely at ease and wearing an expression of such satisfied contentment that it was actually more disturbing than the predator had been. "Well," she said cheerfully, brushing a few leaves off her uniform, "that was refreshing." Nothing quite like a good hunt to get the blood flowing, don't you think? The four cadets stared at her in the kind of stunned silence usually reserved for witnessing violations of fundamental physical laws. "Where," Blix managed, "is the predator?" Hannah glanced back toward the jungle with the casual air of someone checking to see if they'd remembered to lock their car. "Oh, that? Funny story, actually. Turns out the simulation's threat assessment protocols have a few blind spots. Specifically, they're programmed to recognize pack hunting behaviors, group tactics, coordinated responses." She smiled that terrifying smile again. "They're not particularly good with ambush predators who hunt alone." "You killed it," Fenna whispered, her crystalline structure chiming with something that might have been awe or terror. "Killed is such an ugly word," Hannah replied, beginning to pace around their formation with the same casual interest the predator had shown earlier. "I prefer educated. See, the thing about apex predators is that they're used to being apex. They develop certain expectations about how prey behaves. Prey runs, prey hides, prey groups together for safety. Prey does not, as a general rule, double back and start systematically dismantling the hunter's tactical advantages." She paused in front of Jorik, whose scales had shifted to colors that indicated he was reassessing everything he thought he knew about humans and their place in the galactic hierarchy. "Your species has a saying," she said to him. "Something about honorable combat and meeting your enemies blade to blade. The warrior faces death with courage and meets strength with strength," Jorik recited automatically. "Lovely sentiment. Absolute rubbish in practice, but lovely." Hannah's smile gained a sharp edge. "Humans have a different philosophy. We believe in winning. Everything else is just aesthetic preference." Grix swirled with agitation. But the predator was designed to be unbeatable. Its specifications included adaptive learning, threat assessment, and countermeasures for every known combat doctrine in the galactic database. "Every known doctrine," Hannah agreed. "Which brings us to the educational portion of today's exercise. Tell me, what do you know about Earth's military history?" Blix accessed their database with the mechanical precision of a species that had never met a question they couldn't answer through collective knowledge. Primitive warfare characterized by inefficient resource allocation, high casualty rates, and technological disadvantage compared to contemporary galactic standards. Notable primarily for its duration rather than its sophistication. And what do you know about asymmetric warfare? Warfare between opponents of unequal strength, typically resolved through superior technology or numerical advantage." Hannah laughed, the sound echoing through the jungle like a predator's call. "Oh, my dear little hive mind. You've missed the point so completely, it's almost artistic. Asymmetric warfare isn't about being weaker. It's about being different. It's about taking everything your opponent expects you to do and doing something else entirely." She gestured toward the jungle where the predator had vanished, her movements carrying the casual confidence of someone who had just proven a point in the most definitive way possible. That simulation was programmed with every tactical doctrine, every combat philosophy, every strategic framework developed by every species in the known galaxy. It could adapt to Cathani hive-mind coordination, Drakmori honor combat, Zalani empathic warfare, even Netherian collective consciousness tactics. It was, as you said, unbeatable. "But not by you," Fenna observed, her musical voice carrying undertones of something that might have been respect. "Not by humans," Hannah corrected. "See, here's what your databases don't tell you about Earth's military history. We didn't develop one tactical doctrine. We developed hundreds, thousands. Every tribe, every nation, every desperate group of survivors facing extinction developed their own approach to not dying. And then we studied each other. We learned from each other. We stole from each other. She began walking again, but now her movements carried a different quality. Less casual stroll, more something else. Something that made the cadets suddenly aware that they were still standing in formation, still grouped together, still presenting themselves as a unified target. Guerrilla warfare, psychological operations, deception tactics, terror campaigns, honor duels, mass formations, siege warfare, naval tactics, air superiority doctrines, urban combat, wilderness survival. We tried everything, and everything that worked, we kept. Everything that didn't work, we studied anyway, because you never know when your enemy might try it. Jorek was beginning to understand, his warrior's instincts finally catching up with the implications of what he was witnessing. The simulation couldn't adapt because it didn't know what to adapt to. Exactly! Hannah clapped her hands together with delighted approval. It was expecting you to behave like your species. It was prepared for coordinated tactics, logical responses, predictable patterns. Instead, it got a human who'd studied every dirty trick, every underhanded tactic, every dishonorable combat technique developed by a species that spent most of its evolutionary history being hunted by things bigger, stronger, and better equipped than they were. She stopped pacing and faced them directly, her expression shifting from amusement to something more serious. The predator made the same mistake everyone makes when dealing with humans. It assumed that primitive means inferior. It assumed that individual means vulnerable. It assumed that someone who breaks formation and abandons their team is making a tactical error rather than implementing a strategy that predates your civilizations by millions of years. What strategy? Grix asked, their form now completely still with attention. Hannah's smile returned, sharp and predatory, and absolutely terrifying in its implications. Persistence hunting. It's what humans did before we developed tools, before we built cities, before we figured out agriculture. We would pick an animal, usually something bigger and stronger and faster than us, and we would follow it. Not chase it. Follow it. For hours. For days. For weeks, if necessary. Never letting it rest, never letting it feed, never letting it recover. Just following. Waiting. Watching. The jungle around them seemed to pulse with new significance as the cadets began to understand exactly what kind of creature they were dealing with. Eventually, the prey would collapse from exhaustion, and then we would walk up to it and finish the job. No claws, no fangs, no natural weapons, just patience, persistence, and the absolute certainty that we could outlast anything stupid enough to run from us. She gestured toward the space where the predator had screamed. That simulation was designed to hunt pack animals. It was programmed to pursue prey that would eventually tire, make mistakes, reveal weaknesses. It was not programmed to deal with prey that hunts it back. That follows it when it retreats. That studies its patterns, learns its weaknesses, and then systematically exploits every tactical blind spot in its programming. Fenna's crystalline structure chimed with something that sounded like horror. You turned it into prey. I turned it into a learning experience, Hannah corrected. And speaking of learning experiences, she looked around at their formation, their defensive positioning, their careful coordination. You're still doing it wrong. Before any of them could ask what she meant, the jungle exploded with new threats. Not one predator this time, but dozens of smaller ones, emerging from every direction with the coordinated precision of a pack hunt. The simulation, it seemed, was entering its second phase, and the four cadets, still clustered together in their textbook defensive formation, suddenly realized that everything they'd learned about combat was about to be tested by someone who had just demonstrated that humans didn't play by anyone else's rules. "Pop quiz," Hannah called out, as the new threats closed in from all sides. "What's the most dangerous thing about a human in combat?" As the cadets prepared to face overwhelming odds using tactics that had already proven inadequate, Hannah's voice carried one final piece of wisdom through the chaos. "We don't hunt to survive. We hunt because we enjoy it." And somewhere in the jungle, as battle was joined and everything the cadets thought they knew about warfare was about to be proven catastrophically wrong, a human instructor began to teach her final lesson about what it really meant to be apex. The second wave of predators moved like liquid death through the jungle, each one smaller than the original, but exponentially more vicious. Where the first hunter had been methodical, calculating, these were pure aggression given form and purpose. They flowed between the trees with the coordinated precision of a pack that had evolved specifically to take down prey that thought safety came in numbers. "Defensive formation Gamma," Blix commanded, their analytical processes working overtime to calculate attack vectors and threat assessments. "Maintain cohesion. Establish overlapping fields of fire." The four cadets snapped into position with military precision, weapons ready, scanning for targets in the green twilight of the simulated jungle. It was textbook perfect. It was exactly what their training had taught them to do when facing overwhelming odds. It was also, as they were about to learn, exactly what the predators had been programmed to expect. The first three hunters fell on them like a coordinated thunderstorm, coming from angles that should have been impossible to achieve simultaneously. Jorik's warrior reflexes kicked in, his massive frame intercepting the lead attacker with a roar that would have made his ancestors proud. His claws found purchase in biomechanical flesh, tearing through armor plating with the efficiency of evolution, guided by millions of years of warfare. But while he was engaged with one threat, the other two were already flowing around his flanks, moving to exploit the gaps in their formation exactly as they'd been programmed to do. "They're adapting too quickly," Fenna chimed in distress, her empathic senses overwhelmed by the pure, hostile intent radiating from the attacking pack. "I can't predict their movements. They're learning our responses in real time." Grix expanded their gaseous form, trying to create a barrier between the predators and their more vulnerable teammates, but the hunters simply flowed through the interference, their systems filtering out the Netherians' dispersed consciousness like it was an environmental hazard rather than a tactical asset. And through it all, Hannah's voice carried through the chaos with the calm authority of someone providing commentary on a particularly interesting sporting event. "Notice how they're not attacking randomly," she called out, her location still maddeningly impossible to pin down. "They're testing your responses, cataloging your defensive patterns, waiting for you to exhaust your coordinated options. Classic pack behavior. Wear down the prey until they make mistakes." Less commentary. More. "Assistance!" Jorik roared, his scales now showing the bright crimson of combat stress as he grappled with two predators simultaneously. "Oh, but you're learning so much." Hannah's laughter echoed from multiple directions at once. "Tell me, what do you think happens when a pack hunting strategy encounters something that doesn't behave like typical prey?" As if summoned by her question, the real lesson began. The first predator to break off from the main attack didn't retreat. It simply vanished. One moment it was there, The next, it was gone, leaving behind only the faintest rustle of undergrowth and a growing sense that something had gone terribly wrong with its programming. The second hunter lasted long enough to emit that same electronic scream they'd heard earlier before it, too, disappeared into the jungle, though this time they caught a glimpse of something moving with impossible speed through the canopy overhead. "She's hunting them," Blix realized, their compound eyes tracking movement patterns that defied their analytical capabilities. "While we're maintaining defensive positions, the human is conducting active elimination of individual targets." "That's not possible," Grix protested, their gaseous form contracting with confusion. "She's one individual against multiple coordinated opponents. The tactical mathematics don't support." Their observation was cut short by the sight of another predator simply stopping. It had been in mid-leap toward Fenna's crystalline form when something struck it from an angle that should have been impossible to achieve. The hunter crumpled to the jungle floor with the mechanical finality of a machine that had just discovered its off switch. "Mathematics," Hana's voice carried from somewhere above them, accompanied by the sound of something heavy hitting the ground. "Assume that everyone is playing by the same rules. Humans don't play by the same rules. We make up new ones as we go along." The remaining predators, their pack coordination disrupted by the systematic elimination of their numbers, began to exhibit behavior that could only be described as confusion. They'd been programmed to hunt prey that stayed together, that could be surrounded, that would eventually exhaust their defensive options and make fatal mistakes. Instead, they found themselves facing a two-pronged nightmare. 4 highly trained cadets, who, while predictable, were well-armed and professionally competent, and one human who had apparently decided that the best defense was an offense so aggressive it bordered on the psychotic. "This is why we don't include humans in standard tactical simulations," Hana continued her running commentary, her voice now coming from ground level as she emerged from behind a tree that definitely hadn't been large enough to conceal a person moments before. "We tend to break the scenarios in ways that make the programmers very sad." She was carrying something that might once have been part of a predator's sensory array, examining it with the casual interest of someone studying an interesting rock. "You see," she said, tossing the component aside and dusting off her hands, "the fundamental flaw in this whole exercise is that it assumes humans are just another species with predictable behavioral patterns. But we're not. We're the species that looked at evolution and said, 'This is taking too long,' and started doing it ourselves. We're the species that turned warfare into both an art and a science, and then shared notes with our enemies because we thought it would make the fights more interesting." The last predator, now isolated and facing odds that its programming had never anticipated, made the tactical decision that its creators would have been proud of. It attempted to retreat and regroup. It made it approximately 15 meters before Hana stepped out of what had appeared to be solid undergrowth, and politely explained why retreat was not an option. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that suggested the simulation had run out of ways to threaten them. "Exercise complete," announced a voice from the Academy's control systems, carrying undertones that suggested the instructors running the simulation were having some very serious discussions about their programming assumptions. The jungle faded around them, replaced by the sterile walls of Training Bay 12. The 4 cadets stood in their formation, weapons still raised, minds still processing what they'd just witnessed. Hana stretched like someone who'd just finished a pleasant workout, showing no signs of the mortal combat she'd just concluded. "So," she said cheerfully, "what did we learn today?" Jorik was the first to find his voice, his scales slowly shifting from combat colors to something that might have been grudging respect. "That human tactical doctrine is more extensive than our databases suggested. That our understanding of asymmetric warfare was fundamentally incomplete, Blix added, their analytical processes still trying to catalog the techniques they'd witnessed. That individual action can be more effective than group coordination in specific circumstances, Grix contributed, their form still swirling with the effort of processing concepts that challenged their collective consciousness worldview. Fenna chimed softly, her crystalline structure refracting light in patterns that suggested deep thought. That we've been thinking about strength and weakness in entirely wrong terms. Hannah nodded approvingly. All excellent observations, but you're missing the most important lesson. She walked over to where they still stood in formation and casually placed a hand on Jorik's shoulder. The most important lesson is this. Never, ever, underestimate a species that climbed to the top of their food chain twice. Once on their homeworld, where everything was trying to kill them, and once in space, where everything was bigger, stronger, smarter, and better equipped than they were. She smiled that terrifying smile one final time, because the second time around, we knew exactly what we were doing, and we enjoyed every minute of it. As the cadets filed out of the training bay, each lost in their own thoughts about humans and warfare, and the uncomfortable realization that their species might have seriously misjudged their newest galactic neighbors, Hannah remained behind for a moment. "Computer," she said to the empty room, "note for the record. Recommend updating Predator Protocol to include human tactical variants." "Acknowledged," the system replied. "Estimated time for complete tactical integration?" Hannah's laughter echoed in the empty training bay, full of dark promise and infinite possibility. "Oh, my dear digital friend, you're going to need a much bigger database.